Hello and welcome to this Invalsi video seminar. My name is Oliver Page and this is the second of a series of 4 seminars aimed at primary school English teachers, entitled The Living Classroom. Today's seminar is entitled Vocabulary as a Springboard to Communication. In the first seminar, we discussed the ways that English can be used in the classroom in order to make it a place of real communication. We also discussed the classroom as a place of variety, energy, physical movement, memorable materials and activities, and surprise. In this seminar, I'd like to continue with that approach and see how vocabulary can be presented and practiced in memorable, engaging ways, and how to expand students' vocabulary knowledge while at the same time generating meaningful language use in class. Together with practical ideas about how to present and consolidate vocabulary, I will also look at ways to sensitize students to one of the most challenging areas of teaching English for primary school teachers: pronunciation. In formal language learning, we choose the vocabulary we feel our students need to know based on a syllabus usually provided by the textbooks we choose. As far as primary school teaching of vocabulary is concerned, the syllabus is made up of that concrete world of places, objects, colours, our own lives and homes, our feelings and bodies, means of transport, food and school subjects, numbers and animals, and so on. We group words into lexical sets to help memory and to guarantee a foundation of words that students know. But that's not the way we learned our own language, is it? We learned what we needed to learn from a vast exposure of terms. Certainly our family simplified language for us and repeated over and over again words like mum or drink or hello. Our memory of words depends on the frequency that we hear or read them, on how memorable they are when we first hear them, and the importance they represent to us. So, words are also sounds that we can either quickly decipher or have difficulty visualizing and reproducing. When I did my driving license in Italy in 1991, my Italian was okay, but not fluent. And I had to learn the parts of the engine. And to this day, I remember one word in particular, which is spinterogino. And to this day, I have no idea what it is. But the sound of the word was so appealing that I still remember it today. So, our memory works in a highly personal way, selecting words according to how they fit into our world and into our memory. Considering this, it is curious that we expect all our students to learn the same words and that we decide the words they need to know and that we evaluate them on their memory of that set number of words. Personally, as a young teacher, I often found myself disappointed with my students' vocabulary retention, wondering why they didn't remember words I had specifically taught them. But then in time I realized that it's not by memorizing lists that students remember words in the long term, but either because the vocabulary area presented fits into the student's needs and desires to learn. For example, a child who's enthusiastic about football will quickly learn all the terminology connected with football. Or that students need to meet words frequently either through activities engineered by the teacher to recycle them, or by using them in various contexts, and also by regularly hearing them and reading them. So, if we are imposing a group of words for which students have no intrinsic desire to learn them, then we must engineer ways of giving the students time and motivation to learn them. Personally, I strongly feel that just getting a good mark in a test is not motivating in the long term. The student may be motivated by the reward of the good mark or the fear of failure in order to jam those words into their minds. But that doesn't seem to me to be very effective in a long-term period. We memorize for the test, then happily forget. Students need more exposure to language in context and to experience language as meaning, not just as a list of words. So, in today's seminar, I'd like to propose ways to help students to expand their vocabulary through memorable activities and vocabulary games, and also how to reinforce vocabulary and put it into meaningful contexts, and how to use vocabulary as a springboard for communication. But what vocabulary should we teach? Well, that's obvious, isn't it? The ones in the textbook we've chosen for our classroom. But who chose those words? How were they selected? Since the early 60s, with the work of Coursera and Francis, the development of language corpora has revolutionized what we know about the language we use. Language corpora are a collection of texts, either spoken or written, which are analysed by computers in order to examine which words are really in use and how they're most commonly used in a language generally or in a specific field. From this data, we know, for example, that certain words are very common in spoken English, but less so in written English. There are simple differences, such as the pronoun I, which is one of the most common words in spoken English, yet is preceded by he or she in written communication. The word get is used far more widely than its Latin alternatives in spoken English. For example, get over rather than recover, get away rather than escape, get by rather than survive. We also know that certain words are obsolete and no longer in use while still on academic programs. We know that certain idioms popular in the foreign language teaching are in reality hardly ever used. For example, it's raining cats and dogs is actually used very rarely in modern everyday speech. Just think about the revolution in written communication over the last 10 years, thanks to social media. Language corpora have also revolutionized dictionaries. The British publishing house Collins brought out the co-built monolingual learner's dictionary designed for students of English as a foreign language using corpora. The discoveries of computer-analyzed language has been cause for much reflection in the world of textbook writing too. So, corpora provided an empirical method or basis on which to check our intuitions about language. And it made visible what was not clear before. That is to say, it gave evidence for the real use of language. So, in terms of what we actually teach, numerous studies have shown that the language presented in textbooks is frequently still based on intuitions about how we use language, rather than on actual evidence of use. Consequently, corpora revolutionized the idea of what language students need to know, and in order to use language in the context of its real use. This detailed analysis helps either confirm or challenge what has been undisputed in prescriptive or in intuition-led textbooks or syllabuses or dictionaries and other reference material. So when we're setting up a vocabulary syllabus for a class, a teacher has choices. In fact, my first question is that. What choices can you make about the contents of your teaching? The second question is, what can you add or take away? When you're looking at a textbook, is all the language in the textbook really relevant and necessary for your class? Or are there areas of language that your children would be more interested in or that could be more relevant to the place where you're working? And what are the main ingredients of your teaching? Just like to think about your last year of teaching. How often did you break away from the textbook? How often did you prepare materials to put up on the electronic whiteboard if you have it? How often did you use the classroom in a different way than children just sitting and looking forward at you and at the whiteboard? And what were the most successful elements or ingredients of your teaching? Do you stick to a textbook? So, do you decide that the textbook is the Bible? Or do you break away? And have you examined the language used in your textbook? Have you actually looked through the book before and decided which aspects of the language to teach and which not? Have you thought about what you could add? So, considering all of this, I'd like to add that there is a risk too, in the modern English language learning environment, that our school syllabuses fall behind our students' real-life learning. With today's modern technology, teenagers and children demonstrate an explosion in the range of their vocabulary due to the constant daily contact with highly motivating TV programs, songs, video tutorials, online gaming, video games, whatever. Such meaningful contact with language is similar to language acquisition. So the students themselves will be bringing language into the classroom that can be collected and shared amongst the class. It's a good idea, in fact, to have some way of collecting this language every time a student brings a word into the class, either a box or something, a record on the limb. But certainly that language is the real language of their lives, more so than the syllabus that we're teaching. So now let's look more practically at how to approach the teaching of a lexical set. When talking about vocabulary, we are necessarily talking about memory and long-term memory. Students need to remember or recognize a large number of new words, memorize them, and then retain them in their memory. This means having activities in class to present a group of words, to expose students to that language, and then to practice and use it autonomously. So, when we're talking about teaching vocabulary, we're not just talking about presenting it. We're talking about a series of activities across a period of time that will help the student memorize words. For example, you start with a memorable presentation which probably will be accompanied by an image or a clear guide to meaning. That will also be something that the student will hang on to and grasp to hold in their memory to represent the word. Then motivating games and activities with, for example, flashcards or online games or crosswords or whatever, in order to give the student contact with the word in order for them to memorize more deeply. Then controlled practice activities to use the new vocabulary so that it becomes integrated to the student's knowledge. And then reading and listening activities to put the language into context so they continue to see those words, to hear those words. And then frequent recycling activities and games to keep the vocabulary alive. Maybe at the end of every month, you put together all the vocabulary from the month and have a quiz or a sorting activity so that the student continues to see those words and won't forget them. Finally, frequent exposure to general reading and listening texts. Obviously, a general reading text with or listening text with no specific language aim will be a container of lots of different types of language in which the student will find words that they've already studied previously. So let's take, for example, the vocabulary area of the weather. The following succession of activities could all contribute to the student's learning of a lexical set and the development of their communicative competence. So we might start with a presentation of weather items through a clear flashcards or interactive whiteboard presentation to clarify meaning and model pronunciation. We could then move on to a TPR game to show understanding and recognition of the terms. So, for example, a statue game where I could say, it's raining, and everybody creates a statue of them in the rain. Then move on to a sorting game on the whiteboard where terms have to be sorted into, for example, winter and summer, or a photocopy to connect the vocabulary to images. Then a spelling challenge with anagrams on the electronic whiteboard where students have to, under a time limit, for example, change the order of letters in order to make words relating to the weather. Then a short reading description of the seasons where students have to match symbols to each part of the text. Then a weather forecast to listen to and to draw symbols on a map. Then a dialogue build about the weather, a little conversation, a little chat about, oh, what's the weather like in Alaska? It's snowy and cold. And finally, a classroom chart on the wall of the classroom to refer to every day as a classroom ritual that recycles words and makes the language meaningful and real. Obviously, all of these activities are not necessarily in the space of 2 lessons. We're talking about all year making sure that that language recurs, reappears, and is recycled until it becomes something which is solidly part of all of your students' communicative competence. In our planning of a syllabus over the 5 years of primary school, it's essential that we do not teach a linear line of topics, like a kind of history timeline of events, but that we work in expanding circular patterns, like ripples in a pool. Each expanding circle of competence contains the knowledge and competence that the student brings from the previous level and integrates it into this new level. So, children in the first year of primary school may have lexical sets of about 6 to 8 words, for example, animals, colours, classroom objects, etc. While a child in the third year will have consolidated the knowledge of those sets each year, adding other words to reach a wider knowledge of each lexical set and adding new vocabulary areas. So, a student of third year may have expanded a group of 6 or 8 words to as much as 15 or 20. The first grade student may be able to use language to say, it's sunny today. A third grade student will be able to say, it's cold and snowy in the winter. The difference between the two is simply vocabulary and the length of the utterance. Grammatically, both sentences are the same, subject with the verb to be. One particularly important aspect of vocabulary teaching in English is pronunciation, particularly due to the diversity and irregularity of pronunciation of individual letters and spelling patterns. I'd just like to look now at 2 areas that are essential to model when presenting a new lexical set. So, here are some examples of words that although they have the same spelling pattern, the vowel sound is pronounced differently. For example, cut, and put, love and move, blood and food, come and home. This obviously makes spoken English often a poor guide for spelling, and it makes written English an unreliable guide for pronunciation. So clearly, as we're presenting words, we need to present the pronunciation and be sensitive to the fact that there may be words that don't follow what would be an obvious, shall we say, pronunciation pattern according to the spelling. The same difficulties arise if we look at word stress. Italian students very often use the stress patterns from their own language to pronounce words when they see a word that apparently is similar to the Italian. Some classics are, for example, sofa, pronounced sofa and not sofa. The second one, look, giraffe, again, giraffe. Here, performance, or hamburger. Modelling and visualising and practising word stress is essential, both for students' comprehension of vocabulary and their intelligibility when they speak. Using this system of blocks, with smaller and bigger blocks, students can actually visualise and see where the emphasis of each word is. So, while on the one hand, a purely oral presentation of vocabulary will not be a good guide to spelling, on the other hand, a purely written presentation with no modelling of word stress and pronunciation will not be a clear guide to pronunciation. Obviously, students tend to use the spelling rules of their own language and relate them to English, unless the teacher guides them into new spelling rules and gives a guide both to the difference between pronunciation and spelling. When I first started reading in Italian, I'll never forget that I had not visualized it in its written form, but just had it as a kind of sound in my mind. Whilst reading a novel by Maigret, I came across a word I couldn't understand. I couldn't pronounce it. The word was jacka. But because I'd been basing it on my British spelling of jacket, in my mind, the word was spelt with a J. So, students need to meet both spoken model for pronunciation and a written example to learn the spelling. And consequently, we need to plan 2 specific moments to learn each, and then activities to practice them both. For example, teaching emotions, the word tired or scared are pronounced with a silent R. So the pronunciation must not be based on the written spelling, and obviously the written spelling must not be based on the pronunciation. So what exactly are our objectives in terms of pronunciation for our students? Perfect mother tongue pronunciation? Certainly not. In my experience of working in primary schools in Italy, pronunciation is possibly the source of greatest insecurity in primary English teachers. Clearly, a mother tongue or native-like speaker accent is the fruit of either a life lived in that language or years of study and probably a period living abroad. For most primary school teachers, this is not the case. On the contrary, many were prepared in a comparatively short period of time to turn around the poor results in English in the national education system. This by introducing teachers throughout the primary school. Consequently, it's unrealistic to expect teachers with little experience of speaking a language and little exposure to it to be able to imitate the pronunciation of a native-like speaker. So what are the reasonable objectives for primary school teachers in English? Well, I can summarize this in one word: intelligibility. Students need to understand and be understood. Their pronunciation must be recognizably similar to native pronunciation, but not necessarily identical. Take the two words we talked about above, tired and scared. Certainly tired or scared would make the student unintelligible, while tired and scared would be intelligible. Slight variations around those sounds would not impede comprehension. So when should we teach pronunciation, and how? Should it be a separate part of our teaching, or should it be integrated with the presentation of form and vocabulary? I had an excellent student from a liceo linguistico with really good pronunciation, and at 15 years old she was already a good B2 level. She came to me one day completely confused, as her new English teacher had spent the first 3 weeks teaching the phonetic chart and testing the class on how to transcribe English into phonetic script. Consequently, both she and her classmates were getting really bad marks, while being able to pronounce English perfectly well. The tendency to theorize and isolate form or pronunciation too much hails back to the grammar translation style of teaching of the 50s and 60s. Or it reminds me of that dead classroom where I was taught Latin. In my experience, it's important to deal with pronunciation as an integral part of teaching, and obviously of teaching vocabulary, but also grammar and functional presentations. It must be integrated with a language presentation as an essential part of communication and comprehension. So, what are the major issues of pronunciation in the primary school? I'd like to show you some ideas for the two most important areas, which is vowel sounds and word stress. Here are some practical examples of how to integrate pronunciation into your classroom teaching. A fun way of contrasting and sensitizing students to sounds is through discrimination. So, you get the whole class to respond physically to the pronunciation of words in order to discriminate two sounds. I call this physical phonetics. So, working on two vowel sounds that could be E and I, or E and A, or U and U. Use the right and left walls of the classroom. Tell the students to point to the right wall for one sound and to the left for another. For each word, the children respond physically and then repeat the word, so discriminating between the two vowel sounds. They're working physically and also repeating the correct pronunciation. This same activity could be played by associating two colours to the vowel sounds and giving each student two coloured cards, or simply by using their own colouring pencils. They hold up the right colour for each word. Another fun activity for discriminating vowel sounds but focusing on one sound is silly sound chants. To practice a particular vowel sound, chants can help students to play with sounds. They create a simple, silly rhyme combining a series of words with the same sound. You can get your students to do this, or you can do it yourself. Then drill the class to learn the rhyme but stick to the rhythm. To extend the activity, you can add gestures and make a fun physical version of the rhyme, so that this can become part of one of your rituals for the class. Come on, everybody stand up. Let's do the new blue shoe rhyme. Here are two possible examples. These are simply versions which I quickly invented, but you could make up anything for any sound. For example, this one. Two blue shoes. Do you choose your new shoes? How do you move in your new shoes? Or alternatively, a plum in your tum with your dad and mum. It's fun to run under the wonderful sun. Children naturally like playing with chants and rhymes. Adding the gestures, it becomes a really fun classroom activity. Matching patterns. Right. I think it's really important that children start to visualize word stress and patterns. So working on a lexical set such as clothes or whatever, you prepare a series of box patterns to match the words you've presented. You tell the class to divide a piece of paper, an A4 piece of paper, into 4 parts and to write the numbers 1 to 4 on each piece of paper. You then show the patterns on the board and elicit a ba-ba-ba pattern for each. Right. What I mean here is, for example, the word happy is ba-ba, whereas the word Japan is ba-ba. Modelling with an image and also a voice pattern will clearly model the word stress that you're trying to teach. Tell students to hold up the number corresponding to the pattern they hear for each word. You can check and drill words as you present them. So if they choose the correct pattern, get them to produce the word. On this basis, there are many ways to use this game, such as an individual challenge, a bit like Millionaire on television, where an individual student tries to match all the words, not going up a ladder of difficulty. Or you can play it as a teacher versus the class competition, where the class have 15 seconds to agree on a pattern and one spokesperson voices the class's decision. Here on the next slide, I've just done a quick example of how to present the word patterns. So, here are the words and the word patterns. Right, the first pattern is baba. The second pattern is baba. The third pattern is ba-ba-ba. The fourth pattern is ba-ba-ba. And the fifth pattern is ba-ba-ba. Let's have a look at these words. So, the first word is giraffe, which connects to the second pattern. Elephant connects to pattern 4. Tiger to number 1. Monkey to number 1. Kangaroo to number 5. Gorilla to number 3, crocodile to number 4, and mosquito to number 3. So now I'd like to come back to the main topic of this seminar, which is teaching vocabulary. And I'd like to show you a series of practical ideas for each of those stages of the lesson, starting with presentation. So, when presenting vocabulary, the most important thing is to have a clear guide to meaning. And that means a picture, if you can represent it in a picture, or an object, or an action. And it's important that the guide to meaning creates focus and captures the class's attention. It's important also that it's memorable, so that when the child sees the image again or does the gesture again, they connect immediately with the exact meaning of that word. So, here are some ways of presenting language. Obviously, the most common and easiest is to use images. They're obviously very useful for physical, concrete lexical groups, generally between 6 and 12 items. And they can be presented either on an electronic whiteboard or through flashcards. They're also a useful way of presenting, as they can immediately lead to further practice, being an immediate prompt for meaning and use. Here, for example, we've got an electronic whiteboard presentation of clothes, a guide to meaning through the picture, a guide to the written form underneath. Obviously, I would separate those two into 2 different moments of the lesson. Realia. And what do I mean by realia? I mean objects. So this would be obviously, again, concrete lexical word sets such as objects. You could use them for clothes, food, toys, classroom objects, or any other vocabulary area that lends itself to realia. One advantage is you've got sight and touch. So you can play lots of games with the children actually touching or using the objects in further practice. In fact, it leads to games. Leads to games such as the hidden object. When you've got a number of objects, you remove one and the children have to recognize the objects that's missing. Or memory games generally. They're also useful because you can use them in a role play, such as a shopping role play or a lost object role play. Memorable gesture. Well, by this I mean connecting a word with a movement. Obviously, this particularly lends itself to physical lexical sets such as action verbs, illness, emotions, or descriptive adjectives. It also means that the children are learning as they're doing. Activating children in the moment of learning a word helps them to connect it to an action, to their own physicality. And it also means that you can establish a common physical code to vocabulary items to lead the class to games to reinforce. So like the TPR commands that we looked at in the first seminar, those commands are connected immediately to a movement. We could play the game that you give a command and the other person moves, or we could move and the other person gives the command. Word pairs and opposites. It's useful, obviously, when there are natural pairs and it aids memory. When you've got two words that are opposite, it helps the child to connect and collocate the two words so that they can remember them more easily. And the one word becomes the prompt for the other. For example, in family, brother, sister. Descriptive adjectives, long, short. Or adverbs of manner, slowly, quickly. This means that you've got a clarification of meaning because the two words define each other. It can also lead to puzzles, memory games, matching games. And here's just a quick couple of examples. For example, here we've got two pictures that are young and old, small and big, slow and fast, sad and happy, or hot and cold. Grading. Okay, when you've got a number of words that are connected on a scale, it's useful to put them together so that the child can memorize the series of words. Word groups expressing a range of terms. So, for example, the verbs of preference, I love, I like, I don't mind, I dislike, and I hate. Or adverbs of frequency, always, usually, often, sometimes, never. It helps them to actually visualize a range of terms. And it leads to controlled practice and total physical response games. For example, putting love, like, don't mind, don't like, and hate across the walls of the classroom. Students can move to the appropriate verb of preference according to a question. For example, do you like maths? The children move and stand near that word so that they're constantly choosing meaning from the word, expressing their own preferences. And here we have also the presentation of pronunciation. Okay, every time we present a lexical set, we need to model pronunciation by drilling it. Drilling it means you give a model and get your students to repeat it, emphasizing either the pronunciation of particular sounds or the word stress, as we looked at before in this seminar. So it could be a focus on vowel sounds, a, e, for example, bad and bed. Or it could be focusing on special sounds such as th or th or sh. You have an opportunity also to mark the word stress and present it when they meet the word. So here's, for example, a group of words which are simply vegetables, which we might be presenting to a group. So to present the pronunciation, the first word, I would be presenting onion, getting the group to repeat onion, and then emphasizing the vowel sound So onion, onion, and then representing the word stress baba. Group repeats baba, onion, and get the group to repeat onion. The same with pepper. Okay, it's the same word stress pattern. Papa, pepper. Whereas a word like potato needs to be stressed, the weak forms of the first and the third syllables and the strong second syllable. So, papapa, potato. Or the same, papapa, tomato. That way students get a clear model of pronunciation, both of the sounds contained in the words and the word stress. So now I'd like to look at some concrete, practical classroom activities. Vocabulary practice activities that can follow a presentation. The reasons for doing practice activities obviously are to reinforce meaning and also to aid the student to memorize words, to generate practice to consolidate from the presentation, so use the words, to get the student to use vocabulary in context, and to develop listening skills by listening to single words or words in the context of a sentence or a text. So, the first type of activities I'd like to look at are listening recognition games. Right. I'm talking here firstly about mime instructions, the teacher giving instructions, the students demonstrating understanding by movement or mime. The areas that would be very good to use this with would be things like clothes, descriptive adjectives, daily routines, sports, so that the students listen to vocabulary in context and then show their understanding by moving. I'll give you an example. If we were to say, it's the morning, you're getting dressed, put on your socks, and all the students have to imagine putting on socks. We could develop this by adding adjectives or adverbs. For example, you put on a long pullover, so they've got to imagine and put that on. Or if you're doing daily routine, get up slowly. The students slowly get out of bed. This way we're putting the language into the context of a sentence and connecting it with other verbs. However, the students continue to demonstrate their understanding both of the adjective and the action, for example. To connect vocabulary with structures. So, by using a complete structure, for example, everybody, you're watching television, and everybody mimes watching TV. Or, put on a beautiful scarf. You put them into you use imperatives, commands, and students are reacting to the vocabulary item, but not only, they're reacting to it in the context of a communicative sentence. Further recognition games could be to make statues. Statues would be particularly good for jobs, animals, emotions, furniture. Again, you're asking students to react and show their understanding of a word by reacting physically. This, however, statues is really interesting because it's much more controlled. There's not a kind of chaotic movement in the class, but suddenly stillness. And from what the students do, you can see if they've understood the word. Again, you can integrate the language with other structures. For example, commands like make a statue of a king. Or you could just simply say, for example, the verb to be, you are a chef. Further listening recognition games could be by showing understanding by choosing categories. Listening and moving to choose a category. For example, if you were teaching the 4 seasons, you might put winter, summer, autumn, spring in the 4 corners of a room. You could say, it's snowing, and the children have to move to the corner they think is most likely for that season, for that word, in choosing one of the seasons. You could also get students to move to one side of the room or the other side in a line game For example, choosing between confused words like kitchen or chicken, no? Or simply by discriminating between language areas that you've been teaching over the month. For example, if it was chicken and kitchen, you could say, okay, these are the house and these are food. Move to the side that you think the word belongs to. The advantage of this game is that it gives a clear guide to check that students have understood words and that over a period of time they're retaining words and are able to distinguish between them. Another example of recognition games are circle games, circle and touch games. If you find a space in the school, obviously if you're in a classroom with a lot of desks, a lot of these games are difficult to do. But if you've got an area in the school which you could either book or occupy, listen and touch one of a circle of cards. So if you've got flashcards, you put them in a nice big circle. Maybe the category again is something like a daily routine. And you put students either inside the circle in pairs or outside the circle. You could also do this individually, but it's more fun if there are teams or individual challenges. You call the name of one of the cards and the students have to touch it either with a hand or with a foot. If you want to play it as a team game, you keep score. Obviously, competition in a classroom, it depends on the class. It can be negative, it can create arguments, it can create conflict. Otherwise, a single member of the class could represent the class and play against the teacher. Just playing with no points and no competition can be equally valid. You can integrate again this with other language. For example, if you imagine you had food, you could say, I'm in a shop, you're my shop assistant. So, can I have an orange? And they touch the card, the orange. Or I'm talking about myself, oh yes, I love playing football, and they touch the football card. Written recognition games. Again, we're not talking about producing language, but showing an understanding. Again, matching games with words and pictures or matching opposite words on a photocopy or a worksheet would be highly useful. True and false reading games. So, for example, the students have read a text and you could bring up a statement about the text. For example, Jane is 8 years old, and that all of the staff, the class, have true and false cards. They hold up a T or an F, or they move, or you could play in pairs. Smartboard drag and drop games for word sorting. Right, if you have an interactive board, you can put words up on the board and then pictures. You can divide the class into teams if you like, or simply do it as an individual one by one from the class coming up. They simply have to drag one of the words onto the picture that represents that word. You can play this against the clock with two teams. The team has to match all the words, and the time it takes them is then the challenge for the second team. Or you could do it simply as they've got 3 lives they can lose, but the class have to finish all the words losing less than 3 lives. Otherwise, the teacher is the winner. I used to do this as a Chinese torture game where there was a picture of a man with drops, water drops coming onto his head. After 3 drops, he went crazy. Classroom basketball is an interesting game, as you can choose 2 categories of words, for example, clothes and food, and you have 2 baskets, rubbish baskets from the classroom, one for clothes and one for food. You give the student a ball and you say a word, for example, tomatoes. The student has to say food. For that, he gets 1 point. Then if the student manages to throw the ball in the basket, his team get 2 points. It's what I call a missing ingredient. It creates a game-like atmosphere, which is just not a language choice, but also an exciting game to play in teams. Another written production games, right? For example, an anagram race. You can have the class in pairs or teams. where you show an anagram either on the interactive board or on a piece of paper. All the pairs or the two teams then have to write the correct word and then bring it to the teacher or reorganize it on the interactive board or write it on the whiteboard. Or an interesting way of playing this is to have a chair or a desk in the middle of the room where when a team is finished, they slam their piece of paper on the chair. That way, when all the teams are finished, the papers are in the order that they finished. You turn them over and give points if the team is correct. Run and write spelling games. For example, you can say, spell me kitchen, go. And the two students come to the board and write it with the teams helping them maybe. Pass the paper brainstorming. Okay, here, if you imagine, we have food, for example. We could divide into categories of vegetables and fruit, drinks, everything in your fridge, meat. You give out 4 pieces of paper to 4 groups and 4 pens of a different colour for each group. Each group has 1 minute to write as many words as possible on their category, and then the papers rotate around the groups. Consequently, at the end of the game, when every group has had 1 minute to write as many words as possible, you'll have a sheet of paper with words written in different colours. To give points, you give points to all the correct words in the colour of the team that was writing in that colour. Going through the sheets, you can look at the words with the group, correcting spelling and eliciting from the group what's right or wrong about words, if they're correct or not for that category. It's a really effective way of doing recycling of big language areas such as food or action verbs. Guess My List is another similar game in the sense that the teacher says, I've got 8 words here on my list. They're all 8 words from routine. You've got 1 minute in your teams or pairs to write as many words you can think of from this category. Then you're going to read me the words that you wrote. Every word that you have on your list and I have on my list is 1 point. If, unluckily, the words you wrote were not on my list, you don't get a point. And you can play this for many different categories. Online games. There are now a lot of really useful sites that set up exciting online games where you can drag and drop, or you can play hangman, or you can play anagram games. But there's a lot to be found online, and that's really effective for kids today. Okay, oral production games, so speaking games. Chinese Whispers, classic game where you put the children in a line or a circle and you feed in a sentence or a word at the top. For example, I'm wearing, and the teacher feeds into the first person on either the one big circle or two lines. For example, I'm wearing trousers. We feed it in, it whispers, it goes right the way around the group, and the last student, if they can produce that sentence, then either the class win a point against the teacher, or the individual team that got the correct answer win points. Again, it could be played with no competition, no points, just for the satisfaction of the class managing to repeat the sentence. Certainly this is a game to be careful if you have very weak students in the group, because they will be the weak link that makes the group fail, and this could make them object of criticism by other students. A no hands definition quiz. This is a fun game. For example, if you get students in pairs where half the class see a word, maybe on the electronic whiteboard, the other half sit with their backs to the board and can't see it. Their partner then must help them understand the word by giving a definition. For example, a job. If the job is farmer, he might say, he works with animals. No, he gets up early. He lives in the country. Whatever information to help the student. That student puts up their hand, and after most of the class have their hands up, the teacher can choose one student to say the word. Pass the ball elimination, you could put the group into a big circle where you could say, okay, clothes, we're going to pass the ball. Every time we pass the ball, the student must make a sentence. For example, I'm wearing trousers, I'm wearing a skirt, I'm wearing a pullover, I'm wearing a t-shirt. The important thing is that students do not repeat the same word. What you could do is say they can use adjectives in order, so if they repeat the same word, they can change the color or change the size. This can be played as an elimination game with the student that can't think of another word is eliminated, or against the clock. Clearly, if you don't want to eliminate students, and very often it's better not to, you can just simply play with the fact that and Giovanni can't think of one. Okay, let's move on to another category. Memory circle is similar and quite challenging for a big group. Memory circle is when, for example, you say, I went to the shops and I bought a pullover. Passes to the next student who says, I went to the shops and I bought a pullover and a packet of biscuits. The next one, I went to the shops and I bought a pullover, a packet of biscuits and some shoes. Okay, everybody has to try to remember what each of the students said. This could be limited to a category, or could be, for example, daily routine. I got up and washed my teeth. I got up and washed my teeth and had breakfast. Going around the circle. Certainly a class of 25 students, this becomes quite challenging. A flashcard cocktail party. I use flashcards very often to generate short sentences. For example, all the class is standing in the space and you hand out, for example, sports or food, simply using do you like. Students mix around. I come to a student, I say, do you like peppers? The student replies, oh, no, I don't. And then asks me his question. For example, do you like chicken? I say, oh, yes, I do. We then exchange cards and then go to speak to another person. The atmosphere of changing partner constantly and exchanging cards makes it like a cocktail party. Very useful for generating questions like have you got, do you like, can you, and a nice way to start a class, finish a class, or as a practice activity for a vocabulary area you've introduced. Finally, mime lines. It's a similar idea. You put students into two lines. You pass behind one line with a picture. The students mime it, and then the students put up their hands. I choose one student who says, for example, he's wearing a pullover, or he gets up, making a sentence using the flashcard picture vocabulary item that the student mimed. Context. Okay, by putting language into context, we can help students to keep language in mind. Read and mime, for example, is an activity where you could have half of the class with a reading text, half of the class with no text. The teacher then reads the text aloud, but eliminates a word by making a sound like beep. The student reading the text then mimes the word the teacher has eliminated. The students with no text watch the other student, and from listening to the language from the context and watching the student mime, they put up their hands to guess the word that's missing. This is an incredibly interesting game because it involves listening, reading, and producing language orally. Silly substitutes is another interesting game. When you have a reading text, for example, about the weather, when you say in summer, it's often very, and you change the word hot for the word cold. So in the summer, it's often very cold. The students say stop and give you the word that's missing. In this case, hot. And missing word auction would be when you give the students a text and eliminate words from the text. The students try to remember or from context imagine the word that's missing. You can say to them, okay, which word do you think is missing? Each group can decide what they think the word is, and they can actually put money on it. So you could say, I think this word is, and they can bet a certain amount of money. They've got a maximum. And the students obviously buy words if they put the highest bet on it. Finally, vocabulary leads to communication. And so there are many games we can do with this. For example, taboo. I can give a student a word, but then give them words they can't use to define it. This is a classic party game as well. So, for example, if I give the student the word school, I say you can't use student and you can't use teacher. So the student says, I go here every day, there are my friends, we study subjects, and the school and the class have to guess that the word is school. Definitions is similar. Teacher gives definitions, and therefore students must try to understand the word, or students give definitions to other students. No hands communication. Let's imagine that students are in a shop and they need an object, for example, a school bag, but they don't know the word and they can't say it. With their hands behind their backs, you can send students in pairs to other students, and they have to give a definition. For example, I prepare this in the morning, I put my books in it, it's very heavy, everybody in class has got one, and the other students put up their hands and try to remember school bag. Add a word circle. Okay, this was similar to the memory game we played before. But we can substitute words. For example, I've got a clever sister. The second student, I've got an intelligent sister. The next student, I've got a beautiful sister, etc., etc., etc. So substituting an adjective and going around the circle. 5 words in 1 minute, again, is a definitions activity where you can put a collection of words on the board which could be as diverse as famous people, for example, cartoon characters, Mickey Mouse, kitchen and frog. So Mickey Mouse, you can say, he is a mouse, he is on Disney, he's got red trousers, and the other students have to guess who the character is. They say Mickey Mouse. I say, okay, move to the next word. The next word is, for example, friend. I have got a lot. Giovanni is my... And the other student has to guess what the word is. All of these activities will bring the classroom to life, as they are all active, dynamic, very often physical, and involve students working actively in the classroom. So, that's the end of this second seminar. I do hope that it's been useful and that it will help you directly in your classroom practice, and that it helps set up that living classroom that encourages your students to enjoy and engage with the English language. I also hope that it's going to help your students memorize vocabulary over the long term and model pronunciation so that their English is intelligible. I also hope that this 30 minutes of listening for you as a student has helped consolidate language that you don't use every day. So, the next seminar, number 3, will be on role play and dramatization. Thanks for watching, and try things out in class.